Well, thank you very much. My name is Arif Jamal. I'm the liaison librarian for Africana Studies, African Studies, and Social Work. And on behalf of the University Library and the African American Alumni Council, I wanted to welcome you and thank you for coming. In our commemoration of the Black Action Society, the formation of the Black Action Society at Pitt's Total Justice and True Freedom program. So we thank you. And before we start, I want to say some special thank yous to a couple of people, several people who made this event happen. The first is Latara Jones from the African American Alumni Council. She's the historian of the organization, and she contacted the library about the program, so we were able to go from her plan. Secondly, I'd like to thank Ed Galloway. Ed is in the back. Ed is the assistant university librarian for archives and special collections, and he was responsible for getting things together and putting everything sort of together in a very quick amount of time. And last but not least, I want to thank our director, our Dean of Library, Cornelia Tencheva, who's in the back there. For her vision. Some of you may be aware that we are renovating Hillman Library. We're also celebrating our 50th anniversary, like Black Action Society, so there are a couple of institutions on campus that are celebrating their 50th this year. And the library itself is undergoing a renovation, a remake. So for those of you who are in here, in the course of this afternoon, we probably won't hear anything bumping and jumping, so there's no takeovers going on. But each floor in Hillman is going to be renovated. And what we're doing is moving Hillman to meet the needs of a 21st century academic library. So that's going to entail creating new spaces and turning the library into a place where we'll still have books, but also a place where collaboration and knowledge can come together in a way that hasn't happened as much as in the past. So we want to, for those of you who are interested, follow us on Twitter, on Facebook, and keep in touch. And again, for those of you who have archives, these are, times where technology is allowing us to do new things with archives and online retrieval systems. So we want you to keep us in mind as we go forward. Okay. Okay, next, we wanted to look this afternoon at the formation of the Black Action Society. And they're celebrating their 50th anniversary. And 50 years ago, 1968, some of us were in diapers, others were not around, but 1968 was a very instrumental year. And there were a lot of things that were happening. You had, for example, the Vietnam War. Some of you may have been participants in that. You had protests in France. You had the civil rights movement that was going on here in the United States. You had Black students coming to university in higher numbers, bringing more Black students to the university. And sometimes they're finding their Blackness, coming in as Negroes, leaving as Blacks and Africans. And so this is a time where students are demanding things. And so we have an opportunity today to hear from some participants who were there at the time of the formation of the Black Action Society, who were pioneers, founding mothers and fathers in a sense, and who are going to share their experiences with us this afternoon. So the program, we're going to have the actual documents, some of the documents from the Black Action Society. So we have the information, we have participants who were there, so we have a knowledge base. We also have 50 years of reflection, so we have some wisdom. We also have people who were able to benefit from the role that the Black Action Society established out into their communities and back. For those of us who entered the university after the events of '68, many of us came onto the campuses and first time, people with names like Arif Jamal, and people didn't look at you crazy, and part of that was the establishment of a type of consciousness where students were saying, this is who we are, this is what we want, this is where we're going, and this is how we're going to do it. And out of that consciousness came a space in the university where, as before, when you walk into the mirror of the university, you only see the reflection of someone else. And so they created a space where when we look in the mirror at the university, there's a reflection of us. And a type of consciousness that in many ways took from what was going on in civil rights, Black power, where the struggle was seen as not starting in the 50s and 60s. And so realizing that the struggles were built when the first Africans rebelled against being enslaved, all subsequent struggles were based on that. And so you see that in the documents and their inspiration. And so we want to take this opportunity to hear from them. So I'm going to close it. Again, thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules and sharing it with us. And we're going to introduce Zach Brody, who's the university archivist. Zach has assembled a number of documents from the time. They're on display in the back. You're free to look at them. Don't touch them if you have sweets and things on your fingertips. But it's an opportunity to actually see the documents themselves from the time period. And again, we have the people who were there and can tell you the context in which it happened, and we have people who benefited from those efforts and were able to take that space created by the Black Action Society and go out into the community, and you see this interaction between the needs of the community and the wants of the student. So there's an interconnectedness with community engagement that we can see and trace. So thank you, and again, we hope you enjoy the program.
Thank you, Arif. My name is Zach Brode, and I'm the university archivist. I was asked to come up here today and talk a little bit about the importance of the archival record of the Black Action Society. I want to start out by reading the following statements, which were made by 4 different communities at the university from the summer of 1968 through the winter of 1969. From the Constitution of the Black Action Society, quote, "Education is an important element in the struggle for human rights. We intend to use the tools of education to help raise our people to an unprecedented level of excellence and self-respect through their own efforts." From the Student Government President Ken Schuler in the June 25th issue of the Pitt News, quote, "The Black Action Society is not merely another student organization. It is a cultural, social, and political force structured on a consistent philosophy governing the development of a people within our university and society." From a July 1st letter to Chancellor Pasvar from a faculty member in the French and Italian languages department, quote, "There's a very real danger here. Once the precedent of accommodating one special interest group is established, the university cannot in fairness refuse similar favors to other groups. Students who demand and threaten whatever may be their objectives are demonstrating how little qualified they are to be members of an institution of higher learning, much less to guide its policies." And lastly, from a statement by Chancellor Pasvar regarding the January 1969 computer lab sit-in by the Black Action Society, quote, "It was clear that the traditional approaches of the university to teaching, research, and public service were not adequate either for our students' needs or society's demands. We welcome the creative assistance and persistent prodding of the Black Action Society, representing our Black students, faculty, and staff, which we have supported with office space and funds." The statements, all taken from documents in the university archives, show the various points of view on what proved to be a heated topic within the university community. We've heard from African American students seeking to change an environment in which they felt they could not thrive and be successful while still maintaining their identity. A white student body struggling to understand their classmates' grievances, but willing to offer their support. A portion of the faculty that felt it improper for students to make demands of the institution and could not understand that some of the campus population faced discrimination or suffered from a lack of opportunities, and an administration struggling to appease all sides while navigating the necessary policy and programmatic changes through Pitt's bureaucracy to meet the demands made by the Black Action Society. We're fortunate that the archives are able to preserve so many aspects of this revolutionary moment through deposits of university records and donations of material by former Black Action Society members. Not only do these documents, a sampling of which I brought with me today, allow us to tell multiple sides of the same story, and therefore a more complete and accurate history of the events, they also inform and enrich the university's institutional memory. They ensure that the Pitt community will not forget about a small group of students and faculty that challenged the status quo of a system that did not work for them or others like them. That names like Curtis Porter and Gail Austin, and yes, even Chancellor Posvar, will be remembered as agents of change for the university's African American community. They offer a sense of accomplishment and pride for students continuing to fight for the cause and make their voices heard, driving them to succeed. And they tie these actions at Pitt to the greater civil rights movement. As former Black Action Society Chairman Joseph McCormick said 30 years ago at the 20th anniversary celebration of the Black Action Society, the founders, quote, stood on the shoulders of Nat Turner, John Brown, James Chaney, Michael Schwerner, and Andrew Goodman, so that future generations of African Americans and their white compatriots would learn about their sacrifices and accomplishments. I want to encourage those of you who are building on the 50-year legacy of the Black Action Society to please document, document, document. And don't forget the archives when the time comes, so that we can help tell your story and hopefully 50 years from now have an event similar to this and put your great achievements on display. We're fortunate to have some of the participants of the rich history with us today to provide even more depth and details to the stories told on the pages in the collections of the archives. I'm sure their stories will provide even more context to the documents, and I encourage everyone to take a look at the records on display with those stories in mind at the conclusion of this event. Thank you.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
My name is Chunnitz Pettigrew, and I have the pleasure of moderating this panel that will hopefully provide you with some insight and perspective on the founding of the BAS. Zach's done a very good job of giving you some insight into the relevance of this in contemporary moments, and our panelists will follow that up and give you more information than he did. But you'll be able to see the founding of the BAS and its impact across the generations of students here at the university, and really how it changed the course of the university's history. Two of the panelists that are here were in the many meetings and conversations that went on when the BAS was founded, and two others will be able to talk about their experience with the organization as they move through their undergraduate experience. So let me introduce everybody to you, and they are from your left, Dr. Curtis Porter, Education 84, Arts and Sciences 69. He is the Chancellor Emeritus of the Greater Allegheny campus of Penn State University. Gail Austin, Arts and Sciences 68. She is the Director Emeritus of the Academic Resource Center of the University of Pittsburgh. And then there is the Honorable Austin Davis, Arts and Sciences 2012. He's the young guy in the group. He is the Pennsylvania State Representative for District 35. And the Honorable Marita Garrett, Arts and Sciences 07. She is the mayor of the city of Wilkinsburg. We will begin our experience with a conversation between Ms. Austin and Dr. Porter as they explore how the vision turned into reality.
Excellent. Thank you, Chunnitz. And thank you, everyone, for being here. First of all, let me offer my apologies for being late. I will let you know that that's a particular habit of mine, although I could offer an excuse today. But I would suggest to you that I was late for the penultimate experience of the BAS, which was the takeover of the computer center. I was actually late for that. They opened the door and let me in. I was taking care of business, however. I was late for starting my education. I was a U.S. military person for 5 years before I entered the campus of Penn State's then McKeesport campus. And so I'm proud to say I retired from that campus as their chancellor. The Honorable Mr. Austin was one of my former students. But nonetheless, we want to talk about the origins of the BAS and how we got here today and why we are in this room. And I'm pleased to be speaking with my colleague of a long time, Ms. Gail Austin, who her very presence can easily take me back to those early days. The BAS was formed on the eve of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. Gail and I were on the phone the other day, and we remarked as to how it was even possible for people to respond so quickly to events without access to these kinds of devices 50 years ago. But respond we did. That evening, a group of us gathered in the offices of one Dr. Eugene Davis, who was a research psychologist at the University of Pittsburgh, an African-American man. And he had called several students whom he knew. Many of them were members of the Alpha Phi Alpha group. And I suppose Dr. Davis was an Alpha, but I myself was a friend of Dr. Davis, and there were several other persons whom I knew. Some names might ring a bell. Jake Malines was a PhD candidate in psychology. Phil McCain, whom many of you probably would not know, was a graduate student in Gispia. There was myself, and there was also a Margaret Dobbins, who later became Mrs. Jake Malines, who was also to become, I believe, the first black woman city council person for the city of Pittsburgh. That's me trying to get here. I'll figure out how to make this quiet later. But Gail, you will recall that the BAS, even though it was formed in 1968 upon the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, that it probably had its roots in an earlier organization.
Yes, it did, as a matter of fact. First of all, let me tell you a little bit about myself. I was supposed to give some description. Most of has already been said, but it seems like I spent my whole life at the University of Pittsburgh. I first went to Pitt when I was in high school. Shinley High School is right around the corner, and 4 students were chosen from that school because the close proximity to the campus, to go to Pitt in the morning and go to Shinley in the afternoon. So by the time I entered Pitt, my dad was a janitor here, and I found out I could go for nothing if I got admitted. I had some credits, so I guess that's what got me over the edge to get admitted, because
I'll just say it out loud. Go ahead. Please go ahead.
This is me and Curtis' relationship for the last 55 years. So that's, I guess that's all I want to say about myself.
I know what I'm doing. I'm just being disruptive. Go ahead.
I think a little levity always helps, right?
Yeah.
Those who know me know that's a pattern.
So I went undergrad, graduate school here at Pitt, and as Shenna said, I ended my career here after 42 years of directing the Academic Resource Center in the College of Arts and Sciences. So there were 2 things I was supposed to do today following Curtis. One was to give some context to this meeting that Curtis talked about, for 2 reasons. One, because I absolutely do not remember anything about that meeting. And our best guess is that I was in that meeting. There were a lot of us.
believe that you were.
But I do not remember it. I don't recall. But I have considerable clarity about the events that led up to that meeting and to the formation of Black Action Society. Those events are both local and national in scope. Nationally, the student activist movement had already began to take place. There's always these 3 campuses that everybody thinks about when they talk about student activism in the modern era. And those are always the same 3: Berkeley, Columbia, and Kent State, of course. Columbia University, as well as the other two, as you know, were in turmoil. And when Curtis talks about the computer center takeover, one could easily say that the University of Pittsburgh exercised considerable restraint in how that was handled versus how things happen on other campuses. So Berkeley, Columbia, but dozens, if not hundreds of other students, activists all around the country were engaged in these kinds of actions. So the Pitt BAS formation, as well as the takeover in the computer center, all happened in a certain political context. Then there were the events that were actually happening in Pittsburgh and also on campus that I'll briefly mention. And the two events that, more than any other two events that I think led to the formation of BAS, was the visitation of two men who I feel that were as much, if not the most closely associated with the Black liberation movement. And that was in November 1966, Martin Luther King visited the campus. He spoke in the William Pitt Union, which held at the time in the ballroom about 850 people. But there was, as you could imagine, considerable outpouring of people into the lobby where I was, unfortunately. And up to that date, that was the largest number of students who ever attended a visiting speaker at the time. Needless to say, a lot of cameras, a lot of flashing, and probably up until that time, the most exciting event I've probably ever been to in my life. We were able to hear the speech over the loudspeaker that was set up all over the first floor of the William Pitt Union. Those comments that he made that had the most impact on me were certainly the comments he made about the civil rights movement and nonviolent action. Of course, you know, he addressed that. But what had the most impact on me were his comments about the Vietnam War. To the day, I owe my stance in terms of the war to that speech, although it meant a lot more to me later. But it did provoke me to think about imperialism, U.S. imperialism, and today I consider myself a staunch anti-imperialist, mainly because of Martin Luther King. As you know, a year later at Riverside Church in Manhattan, he spoke much more about it in a famous speech that people talk very little about because he was developing this anti-imperialist stance and certainly relating to, you know, the Vietnam War and the civil rights movement at the time were pulling away from him. And he mentions this in his speech in the William Pitt Union. There were three things that were bothering him at the time. One was his fellow civil rights comrades and colleagues were pulling away from him, the Vietnam War, and Black Power. And he says that specifically in the end of his speech. Which brings me to the second event, and that was the visitation here about 6 months later of Stokely Carmichael, who later became known as Kwame Ture. But for the purposes of my comments, I like to call him Stokely because that's what we all called him. It was Dr. King, and you referred to Stokely by his first name. He was on a first name basis, pretty much everybody. He spoke outdoors on the steps in that porch or veranda, whatever it's called, in front of the Student Union, and it faced the soldiers and sailors. Big crowd, different than those people who were in Martin Luther King's speech, because he was also accompanied by a lot of, as you would imagine, clergy, media. Stokely was Stokely and Cleveland Sellers, as far as I know. No entourage, and he was spectacular. His speech was a call to action, and more than any other lecture that I think black students had heard at the University of Pittsburgh at that time. It had a tremendous impact on us. I mean, tremendous. I really can't find the words to express how important that was to all of us. And after that was over, he also spoke again at Ebenezer Baptist Church in the Hill District. And again, it was the call to action. He was calling on all black people to act. It was not the first time, but one of the few times that the term black power was being used. The first time he talked about it in a really public way was at a march in Mississippi organized by James Meredith called the March Against Fear. And he was being pulled by SNCC, where he was, of course, the chairman of the Student Non-Violent Coordinating Committee. They said, say it, say it, say it. The crowd was building, it was building, it was building. And he finally said, it's call for black power. And this was starting to circulate all over the country. So quite naturally, up at Ebenezer Baptist Church, which was considered a much more friendlier environment than the University of Pittsburgh, that was the call. And the call to action spoke to me, Curtis, and everybody who we were around. We were just, I think in terms of King and Stokely, we felt the same about them both in some similar ways, different ways, but I'm sure the intellect had a lot to do with it. We were college students. We had not ever heard intellectual lectures like this except at the University of Pittsburgh probably, but their intellect was directed toward us and a call to action for what we to do, you know. And I think I would be on safe ground if I said if the students who were with Curtis and I at the time had to choose and say, this is who I'm following. I don't like to dichotomize everything. We're in this world, everything's Republican or Democrat, King, or that wasn't it. I personally don't refer to it as a civil rights movement versus the Black Power movement. I think it's the Black liberation movement that has its roots all the way back to as soon as they brought us over here. We've been in a struggle, but I digress. I would say that most people felt in our circle a tie to the Black Power struggle, and I may be wrong, Curtis, where we're going.
No, I think you're right.
So, although, like I said, for years to come, I always felt, considerable respect for King. But so what did we do? I mean, we had a call to action. We had to do something. We were in for it, and out of that, we organized a group called Afro-American Cultural Society, which I say was the forerunner to the Black Action Society, and I think Curtis does too.
Well, that's accurate.
So that was how we responded to the call. It was an organization of both students and community people. And it was considerably present on Pitt's campus, and it was also present in Homewood and in the Hill. And with that, I think Curtis might have something to say now with its development of the Afro-American Cultural Society that grew directly out of the call for Black Power from Stokely Carmichael, and indirectly, I think, from the presence of Dr. King on campus, but definitely directly from Stokely Carmichael.
Yeah, I think Gail pointed out a number of things. One, the transition. When you talk about the lack of a dichotomy between King and Carmichael, I think you're also pointing out the progression of the struggle. You see that King was on a progression himself as he keyed his struggle from civil rights to looking at the war in Vietnam, which, by the way, in Vietnam they call that the American War.
Right.
his struggle began to focus on the political and economic struggle of black people and of oppressed people worldwide. Carmichael had already gotten there, as had, for example, Malcolm X. And both King and Malcolm X had been assassinated before their ideologies had reached full fruition, whereas Carmichael had the opportunity as a young man to further develop his ideology. And so even that in that 6-month period between those speeches, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, as a member, as a part of that whole civil rights coalition, had begun to move more directly into a politicalized struggle than was the SCLC, for example, the Southern Christian Leadership Council, which was the broad umbrella group that King represented as the head. So yeah, I think that as I recall Carmichael's presentation, he first spoke in that big room in the Student Union building.
Don't remember.
And he was a very charismatic speaker, and he suggested to all the students present that they needed to organize, and that's that call to action. And he spoke to a rump group after his presentation, and he also spoke on the steps of the Student Union building.
Okay.
Julian Bond was there, Cleveland Sellers, whose son, by the way, you see all the time on CNN, Bakari Sellers. Cleveland Sellers got framed, but also was able to retire as a university president. So there's tremendous talent that was available to this struggle. But where Gail is pushing the ball back to me, vis-a-vis the African American Cultural Society, the African American Cultural Society was a good friend of ours, Letty Hayden, described it as a collection of people who were, the reason why it didn't work, because there were too many smart black people in one place at the same time. Now that's not accurate, but it kind of like was, but what he left out was too many smart black people in the same place at the same time with no money and very few resources to apply to whatever strategies we may have come up with. We had a lot of great ideas, and we've done a lot of things. We actually, the organization actually existed not only on Pitt's campus, but on all the campuses in Pittsburgh, at Chatham, at then Carnegie Tech, at Point Park, at Duquesne, as did the BAS in its early formulation. There were BAS chapters to be founded on all of those campuses. This was a citywide organization, but Pitt was the core. And the difference between the two was that if the failure of the African American Cultural Society, which existed from 66 through maybe 60, well, roughly 68, diminished it towards 68, and gave rise to the BAS, was if the failure of I wouldn't call it true failure because a lot of things were accomplished. We published August Wilson, for example, and one of his first publications was probably in a publication that the African American Cultural Society published when he was a poet.
That's right.
I was the chairman of the African American Cultural Society. That probably was not a great choice. I probably was a better producer than an executive at that point, which was, I think, proven when we did form the Black Action Society, and I was the program chair, and we were able to literally produce a cultural revolution in the city of Pittsburgh through the auspices of the Black Action Society. How did we do that? Because looking at and I will call it I can't say that word, D-I-M-U-N.
Diminutive or diminution.
Of the African American Cultural Society.
Too many smart people.
What we learned, too many smart people, not enough big words. What we learned from that experience is that we lacked resources. And so if you look at the Constitution and or the demands of the Black Action Society, which I'm sure are on display here, in that language you'll find some very important terms. The first thing that we asked for was an office and a budget and the means of communication, which were all the things that the African American Cultural Society lacked. And so from there, we were able to position ourselves strategically and tactically to try to make a difference as against the things that we thought were important. vis-a-vis that movement that Gail described that was broad-based, both in terms of the anti-war movement, the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement. The BAS was able, with those kinds of resources, to literally benchmark the struggle in a variety of locations. In terms of benchmarking what we thought ought to be a Black Studies program, we traveled to Merritt College, where the first Black Studies program was the first Black Studies, the idea for a Black Studies program. As near as we could tell, that's where it first was espoused. And so we went there under the resources that we had gained as the BAS, a student organization that had its own budget. We went to Chicago. We spoke to people like Don L. Lee and the Black People's Topographical Research Center. We went to various locations in colleges and universities where people were struggling with this idea of Black Studies, and we connected with Ivy League. We connected with people at Cornell and at Harvard and at Pennsylvania, University of Pennsylvania, and a variety of different locations before we ever put pen to paper in terms of what our demands would be, in terms of what we thought a Black Studies program ought to look like. For example, we thought it necessarily needed to be a department at minimum, because we noticed that programs came into being and went out of favor rather rapidly, whereas departments were a strategic foothold in the institution. And so we propose that it ought to be a department with degree granting capability and the ability to have tenured faculty. So the BAS and its progeny, the Black Studies Department, for example, was able to gain the resources from that experience from the BAS. And by benchmarking other elements of that movement and that struggle that was extant at the time, to really position itself as a powerful organization, a community-based organization on campus, headed by students who work very closely with people in the community. We worked with Nate Smith, we worked with Salahuddin, we worked with Ed Ellis, who ran the Halfway Art Gallery, we worked with Rob Penny and August Wilson, who were poets on Center Avenue, we worked with Nick Flanoy, who was a community leader in Homewood, we worked with a variety of people in Northside, we worked with the people all across this city, and as Gail and I remarked the other day, it looks like telephones were growing out of our ears. Because once we got that budget and got access to the university's long-distance trunk line, we were constantly in contact with people. So I don't know how much time we have to...
Well, we're going to need to bring in some of the youthful folks and get their perspective to see where they are. Now, obviously, what we know about the BAS in contemporary times may be a little bit different. We know it was a comprehensive organization that touched many parts of this city. We know that their attempt was to really change the University of Pittsburgh and change the city of Pittsburgh. So I'm going to ask Marita what she perceives of the BAS from her experience and how it impacted her time here on campus, and maybe even reflect on what she's already heard.
Yeah, so thankfully we are the recipients of the work that both of you did in formulating this in the larger part. And I was actually taking notes, because BAS to me is one entity, but so much came from your organization in that meeting. So I started going down the line. Focus as a freshman, that was a really big thing. That was for underrepresented freshman students. And so particularly those who are minority students, and that was a really great way to help build community. We would go on field trips, go see plays, all those types of different things to really expose the freshman class, but especially those who maybe didn't get that same exposure back home. So to me, that's kind of one branch from it, as well as, Some of God's Children, the choir, amazing choir, the spring concert, everybody was there. Additionally, myself, when I started at Pitt, I started off thinking I was going to go into pre-med, supposed to be a pediatrician, but his plan, a couple turns, but the pre-medical organization for minority students. So again, if it wasn't for you all for demanding, a foundation in that platform, all those things wouldn't have offshoot from that, but specifically going back to Black Action Society, going back to that exposure and knowing just first and foremost, you have a community that looks like you. We have, even though each of us, we're different, coming from different places, but you knew it felt like a family. If you were the only one in your classes, and especially as pre-med, very much the only one in some of these science and math classes, but I always knew could go to a BAS meeting, feel like you're at home. I knew I could go to a study session, feel like home. And again, many of the different events that I just was thinking about, Black Homecoming Week, the fun and fellowship within that. Additionally, Black Line, I loved reading that. I was just talking, I can't remember who, but I was talking to, Kay Oyegan, who is now a writer for This Is Us. She started off writing for Black Line. And so it's just, funny to see it all come full circle. And also because of BAS, I was able to meet and hear Nikki Giovanni speak. I was able to hear Martin Luther King III come and speak. So all these great platforms where, it was right there and it was cultivated for us. I'm truly grateful. And because of my time here at Pitt and specifically being a part of the Black Action Society, I believe that's really what helped to create that passion and commitment to community outreach that I've developed. Actually, looking at Mario, I used to be a work study at the Center for Minority Health. So everything just really comes full circle. But again, it had to start somewhere, and you all started the impetus for that.
Austin.
Yes, which Austin?
This
Austin.
Austin.
Oh.
I knew that was going to happen. I
You
just
know
wanna
what?
see-
Chennis calls me by my last name all the time. So that's why I said he always calls me Austin. So,
I do.
Thank you.
Austin.
Yeah.
Okay.
But Austin, who was the president of the student government at one time, is that?
I was a senator, yeah.
He was a senator.
Yeah.
Okay, well, he's a representative now. He's aspires maybe to be a senator, so he was a senator first. But then as a senator, talk to me a little bit about the budget that Dr. Porter talked about and how it sustains BAS until this moment.
I don't remember it being as controversial, I'm sure, as when you were fighting for a budget from student government. But I think we honored almost every request that they put forward at the time when I was there. I don't remember there ever being a lot of pushback, primarily because BAS is one of those organizations that not only is rich in history, but there's a strong educational purpose to it, and it serves a significant need in the university community. It creates a safe space for a lot of African Americans when they come to school and helps them with their transition. I grew up in McKeesport, and I was the first generation of my family to go to college. So when I stepped onto a college campus for the first time, I didn't have a lot of people who could kind of fill me in on what college would be like when I got there. So I kind of had to figure it out on my own. And BAS kind of created a family for you. And not just creating a family, but it gave you a voice on campus. It gave you a way to advocate for the things that you believe in a structured environment. And really, when I was listening to you talk about the civil rights movement, a lot of Black elected officials and politicians were born out of the civil rights movement. We saw after the Civil Rights Act was passed and the Voting Rights Act passed, there were significant increases in the number of African Americans that were elected to Congress in the years succeeding that in the state legislatures. And it's interesting. So I just got elected in January, and I represent a district that's only 23% African American. In a district that most people would have probably thought an African American would never be their state representative. But it really just shows, how far we've come. But even though we've come that far, a lot of the issues are still the same, right? We're still fighting for economic justice. We're still fighting for racial justice. We're seeing a lot of the same battles that were fought in the civil rights movement that we're still fighting today. So I think it's still a very needed voice, and it created a really good structure for me. And how activism and public policy go hand in hand, and how they, in most cases, can work together to create a positive solution for the community, and oftentimes when they aren't working together, when it can hold government officials accountable for what they're doing in office.
when you have an opportunity to read the demands that went to Chancellor Pasvar in May of 1968, the first thing, my experience, was that all of the information gathering and all the due diligence that went on created a model for successful engagement in this environment of educational equity for this campus. I was part of the recruiting team, and my job was to get them here, get them through, get them money, get them out, do whatever it took to do all of those things. But what you should understand is that in these demands really is a model: recruit and support. You don't recruit them without supporting them. You need faculty, you need administrators, you need money, you need a department that can reflect the intellect of the African experience, the African diaspora. All of those things were things that were put into the demands, and if you read them, you can see that it was a very strategic, well thought out presentation that got everybody's attention. And the other thing for me was that they wanted to reduce any of the negative labels that are associated with providing opportunity. We are culturally deprived, educationally different, high risk, which is still really in our vernacular, which we really sometimes hear. I hear it in the medical school sometimes. So anyway, all of these things were very important. So as you look back, Gail and Curtis, how do you think you did?
I think it's important that
we're going to open it up to questions after they sort of summarize their thoughts and reflect back a little.
I think it's important that we listen to Curtis a little bit more about what happened when the demands were not addressed. There was a period when that did not happen, and that's why there was a computer takeover. And even though you were late in that room, I think you could I think maybe they deserve at least a 1 or 2 minute, because we have not addressed that. I think that needs to be addressed. Go ahead, Curtis.
To be fair, I was late in that room because I was spending my time calling people in the community to get them to support those who were in the room. The effort that we put afoot was to be always, everything that we did was to be a campus community effort. We described ourselves as the black community on campus, and we never wanted to be thought of as the black campus community, because that in and of itself would isolate us. So we always wanted to be thought of as in the larger context, as the black community on campus. And so I had been spending my time calling people in the community to get them to support those students who had chosen to risk, frankly, their careers and taking over that computer center. But there was a strategy behind it. I'll tell you a little bit about it later, and I'll be very brief. The reason why students felt it was necessary to take dramatic and indeed strategic action is because while the demands were, as Chen has suggested, very strategic and we thought comprehensive, particularly for mostly undergraduate students, although several of us were graduate students. I was a graduate student in urban affairs. Jack Daniel, in fact, was a young assistant professor. Gail, I don't know if you were yet.
I was so much younger than all you.
You were so much younger. And,
I was.
she was
we think about
in
this
preschool.
I think it's important that we do talk about this age thing for just a second. You know, I was 21, and a lot of the people around us 21.
Undergraduates.
And we were undergraduates building these programs, which
It's amazing
didn't
thing.
seem like a big thing then.
And some were younger than you.
Yeah, and then to look back on it 50 years later and say, wow, 21 years old, building, hiring. I mean, there's so much more history we could talk about, and that has to be another panel. But the establishment of Project A, the 3M program, Developmental Scholars Program, Black Studies Program, hiring black faculty, it sort of boggles the mind that we did this when we were like 21, 22 years old.
It's incredible. It's incredible the range of things.
Yeah, the range of things that had to be done And most of these things had to be done over a 4-month period in the summer because, and again, I think this is important. I hope I'm not going too far afield, but okay, I don't know. Is there more you want to say about what happened in that room?
The only reason I
Because
can be
we
very, I
had
can
to-
say in 2 sentences, the
Okay.
reason why students took over the computer center is because while there was an early and fairly rapid response to the demands in terms of allowing us the office, the budget line, the student, the student to allowed to be a student club with an official budget and the ability to command resources, there was a long lag on the broader and more substantive demands. And so we considered that we were not going to be bought off by the little plastic goodies, as we called them, that we had been given. And so while we were entertained by meeting after meeting after meeting, it became very clear to us that the meeting after meeting after meeting was a polite way, and indeed a political way, of forestalling our more substantial demands. And so we determined that we needed to take more deeply tactical action
Yes,
that would make a
yes.
difference, and that became the computer center takeover.
That was the takeover. And I think that's important that you know about that takeover. And that the takeover demands were addressed. And this is where I don't think I'm differing with you on this point, but about the need to have office space on campus. I never saw that as a big need because we were meeting in the Hill District. And that brings me to the point I wanted to make that's really important here, is that the demands met, you got 50 students, do something with them. And these were African-American students, all from Pittsburgh except 2. One was from Chicago and one was from New York. I don't believe I remember that. But anyway, you know where the admissions committee meeting was? It was on Heron Avenue. We got the folders from the admissions office. We went to Heron Avenue and spread them out in,
Exactly.
what was that space?
Kramer Bazell was a community action organizer.
Yeah, and
that was where his
yeah.
offices were.
And that we're in somebody's office. Can you imagine in 2018 that we go in the admissions office, get 50? I mean that.
The
You know what I'm
university
saying?
The university
Yeah,
had started this program for underrepresented,
culturally deprived,
poorly educated,
high-risk students. Yeah.
poor little black kids.
Yeah, poor and it had a poor little black kid name. It was called Project A. Yeah, so, I mean, that sounds like something in a lab, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So what we did is we immediately changed that after the summer experience was over to Martin Malcolm Marcus Scholarship Program. A little top-heavy on the male thing, but I developed So anyway, we admit these students, we spend a summer with them. They get admissions, they got an admissions letter, but it was going so fast, we had to call them each up. They didn't have time to have an admission, so we sent them admissions letter. Now, we have the folders. I mean, admissions office has nothing to do with this. And we called each student, asked them to come here, you know, and we have to hire faculty. This is all done by 21 years, and even Curtis was a few years, but he wasn't 25. Yeah, he wasn't 25, you know. And I mean, you were a couple years. I mean, people 21 to 25 years old developing an academic program because we developed 3 courses they had to take. We brought in speakers. A really big part of this, which hasn't been mentioned, is kind of what I do more now, and that is there was the Black Arts movement. You know, and we would bring in poets. You know, we developed this, and it seems like we wouldn't even buy books from the University Pitt bookstore. We bought our books from a vendor in the Hill.
First, we bought it from a vendor in the Hill. Then we started buying them from the Harambe bookstore.
Yes, then we started buying them from Harambe bookstore. Again, this was something that we did in a matter of weeks. The students came about mid-June in Project A, and they were here until maybe the second week in August. It was a full trimester. Pitt didn't call their terms semesters then, they were called trimesters. And so there were just so many, I mean, you know, Black Arts Movement. We had a Mary Baraka come, you know, we had all of this going within a really tight four-month period. And then things became a little bit more formally structured in the fall of that year. And I really don't know very much about that, because at the end of August, I went to the first Black Power Conference in Philadelphia, and I kind of got waylaid a little bit about the efforts that I was doing here in Pittsburgh. But I'm sure that you have a great recollection of what happened after that. But I do not remember at all or have the feeling that I didn't have office space and that sort of thing, because we met in the Hill. We met in the Hill District.
Well, there were in that regard, there were just a number of different prongs of activity that were ongoing. And it was all about trying to establish a strategic foothold that would move the movement forward, and that the university was seen as almost like a landing base to move that movement, given that the university in and of itself was an institution beyond its learning infrastructure. It was a primary political economic institution in the city of Pittsburgh that had great influence over the communities within the city and that surround the city. And to the extent that the populations in those communities need to be responded to by this institution, it was seen as this institution ought to be targeted to not only be responded to by those communities, but to be responsive to those communities. So there were a lot of different lines of movement activity that was seen, and one of them was to establish a foothold at the University of Pittsburgh. And so the BAS became sort of like a forefront for doing that, a beachfront, if you will.
Did we leave room for questions, or?
Yeah, we have room. We have room for questions. So we have a process. There's some people out there with some microphones. Certainly, we have only really scratched the surface based upon what I know. But we have two people here who really did do a lot of the heavy lifting that made a very critical difference in the history of this particular institution. There's no doubt about it. So, with that said, if there are any questions from the audience, why don't we have the opportunity for you to get your questions addressed. Dr. Glasgow.
You should already know.
You should already know.
Oh, and I'm telling you, what he doesn't know, he's going to call me up and ask me.
In the fall of '69 to teach African American history. Yes. As an indication of how together the students were, I remember the department selected me, but I had to go through an interview procedure with the Black Action Society as to whether it would pass muster. And I was like, oh, fear and trepidation, like, I don't know if I signed up for this. But I will say how impressed I was by the caliber of the questions that were asked, the seriousness of it. We wound up with just a wonderful, wonderful exchange. And it made a very, very positive, strong impression on me, just how together and informed the students were. The other thing was, the early days of the Black Studies department was also so impressive in terms of what they were doing and what the students were doing there too. The walls, of course, were painted red, black, and green. Strong red, black, and green. But it was one of the most lively and exciting places to be. I think on Friday, they had a weekly seminar where the faculty would present papers or students would present papers, and they were debated and discussed. It was a really exciting intellectual time, one that, and that lasted for a number of years, a lot of years. And it's the sort of thing you think, if we could recreate that sort of energy and enthusiasm and seriousness today, I really think it was a model, and it'd be nice to see those programs. And I'm really happy to see, apparently the archives of BAS are now part of the university.
Digitized.
That was my, Okay, that is really, really wonderful. So that people, me, my students, and others can really tell this really important and wonderful story of BAS and the Black Studies Department, what it meant here.
Are there any undergraduates here? Stand up, please. I don't want to embarrass you, but would you stand up? Yes.
How are you?
Undergraduate.
Undergraduates.
Undergraduate.
No, I'm not an undergrad.
No, I just
Yes,
want.
he asked for the undergraduates
Yeah.
to stand up first.
Yeah, I want to thank you for coming. When I was preparing for this, much as I love half the people in here and I know them so well, what I planned to say was not for them. And I'm just so sorry we don't have more undergraduates in the room. And I'm so very, very happy that you came. What's your name? And Sakari, what year are you in? Senior? Oh, see, this is the only thing. Student activism is always influenced by the circular nature of when people are on campus and when they leave, you know. And I would like to talk to you after, okay? Thank you so much for coming, okay?
Other questions? You had a question?
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Yes, I'm not from the University of Pittsburgh, but I'm a colonial, and I worked with a couple of the people that are up there when, during this period of time, there was a national and a neighborhood thrust of organization and nationalism that we had during the early 70s and the late 60s. What are your ideas on how to rekindle that and get the neighborhoods more involved in some of the programs today, like the STEM program, which is, you know, your academics and your math and sciences, and some of the more of the community involvement, and starting with the younger people and some of the teenagers. So by the time it's for them to go to college, we can get them here, because it seems to me right now there's no path for them, or it's a very difficult path.
If I understand your question, I think you're asking what it is that perhaps young people who are at the University of Pittsburgh might do to keep this kind of
Yes.
activism going.
Right, we have young people.
Yeah, well, that was why I said it's too bad there's not more undergraduates here. I'm not worried. I know people are concerned, but I'm not. Student activism really begins around the turn of the century, around the early 19th century. Whenever there was campus issues that affected particularly black people responded. And that's from 1900 on. This might be a period where I think people feel that, you know, all this talk about millennials being self-centered and all these things. You know, when people's needs are threatened, I think people respond. And I have a great deal of optimism about today's young people through the Black Lives Matter issue. I think black young people should also find friends, other groups, irrespective of whether or not they're African American, to collaborate with and build coalitions, but not before establishing a very strong organization yourself. Go into those coalitions with objectives and goals that won't get usurped within a bigger coalition. I thought of two things that I think, and I say this humbly because I don't think it's my place to say what African American students should do here who are undergraduates. But certainly I know that since I left here in 2012, black enrollment's gone down. All you have to do is drive through the campus. I don't know the data and the stats, but I would like to see campus-wide, student-led, black student-led action about those things that we so fervently work toward in the late 60s. Again, I say that humbly because I don't think it's my place to say that. How do you feel, sir? What do you think? Yeah. And the other, for me, is the escalating cost of going to education, getting an education, I think is sometimes I can't even believe how difficult it is for people to get through this institution, and it's a public institution. When I went to Pitt, it was private, believe it or not. That's how old I am. And it was the same cost as Harvard University at the time. Thank God my dad worked here and I went for nothing. But certainly, there's only so much you could do at the University of Pittsburgh. This is a national struggle, and I would like to see Pitt students address that. I mean, even if you're on a scholarship, students are coming out with $50,000, $60,000 in loan for undergraduate education. I think there has to be some national action against this. No other developed country in the world has the kind of, bills to students. Developed countries in Europe and elsewhere, undergraduate education is essentially free for those people who want to access it that way. So those are two things that I would like to
Gil,
see.
I'm impressed that we have two young people on a panel, both of whom are elected officials. And I think that there's a very clear battlefield right now, and that's the political front. And there are looming elections in November. And I think that that's like an all-hands-on-deck opportunity for young people, whether they're 18 yet or not. And I think that the students at Parkland in Florida have shown that that's an opportunity for young people. And I think that the students in the Black Lives Matter efforts, as you have mentioned, before them have shown that that's an opportunity. And I think that when the groups of those young people meet, and I believe that eventually they will, they have at least the potential to be the 21st century version of what happened when the students, black and white, formed the sit-in movement of the 60s. Because before the students of, white students primarily, of the North began to go south in the sit-in movement, blacks were getting beat in the South, and there was not much to do about it. And so I think that now that this spotlight has broadened, and there is this political front, and that yields to this challenge of why in the most developed country in the world are we mortgaging our students' education? It makes no sense. And I am a retired university executive. I was chancellor at Penn State Greater Allegheny. Part of my challenge was finding students to bring in more tuition, which was always a huge contradiction. For example, to be sending my admissions officers to China and India, as well as to the more affluent areas of the city and out of state to gather students, even if to be able to afford to bring in the students from McKeesport and Homewood and Braddock. In order to do that, you have to bring in students from China and India. So that calculus makes no sense in the United States. And so that is a political issue. And I think that this notion that you expressed about coalition, I think there's a really powerful possibility for young people to awaken politically. And while I've seen some, and the social media is a huge potential, while I think that there may not be like really visible, if you look at it in like kind of like a materialistic view of what's going on in communities, but if you take a look at the digital screens in terms of what's going on in communities, there's a whole lot of consciousness in these communities. And there's a whole lot of consideration and concern about what's going to happen with our young people. what's going to happen in this digital universe. And there's a whole lot of concern with gun violence, and it's gun violence in terms of mass shootings, and there's also gun violence in terms of state violence against minority people. And so all of this kind of meets somewhere. Somewhere these things thread together. And so I think we're on the cusp of a large conversation there, and a possible coalition.
Yeah, I agree. And just to piggyback off of social media, that is a powerful tool that people, I mean, it's so powerful that other countries are trying to influence our social media in the United States vis-a-vis our elections, what we consume, what we see, because people understand the power. Imagine if you had a Facebook or a Twitter in the civil rights movement. I mean, imagine, that I can know what's going on in Texas from sitting right here, or somebody can literally go live right now and broadcast to 10,000 people and tell them what's going on in their current situation. And I think you're seeing a lot of younger activists and politicians take advantage of it. I know I take advantage of it a lot, just in terms of what I'm doing in my office and my activism. I know Marita does as well, because we'd be crazy not to. And we certainly wouldn't be in office for very long if we did.
Also, it's free, so
Yeah.
there's no barrier.
Right.
You sign up for Facebook, and especially as you're talking about younger people, and you're talking about mortgaging our education. So, our funds, they always talk about millennial generation. Why aren't they buying homes? Because we have 2 to 3 side hustles on top of our main job. So one less expense is great, and that also removes a barrier for people, or especially younger people who want to campaign for office. Social media, like you said, we'd be crazy not to use it, but it's also universal and it's free.
And I'll just piggyback that millennials, while we don't have a lot of resources in terms of financial because of the burden debt, they're still willing to put their money where their mouth is. I mean, I have seen younger people write checks to organizations that they believe in, and they don't own homes and they don't have stock portfolios, but it's because it's an issue that they believe in, so they're willing to invest in it. And I've seen that happen on more than one occasion.
I just saw a posting by Sean King where they raised $29,000 in 4 days for a campaign for a district attorney's office in Texas.
Yes. Right.
In 4 days, they raised $29,000. And that's just the beginning of the campaign. As they have a campaign to impact the district attorney elections across the country, because that's the place where all the people are going to jail.
And so, you're really seeing that movement happen a lot. It just, in Philadelphia is a perfect example. Larry Krasner, a new district attorney in Philadelphia, there was a huge movement to elect a progressive district attorney, because that's so much of where criminal justice policy happens, is in the district attorney's office. So it's powerful.
So I think that the political front is one in which young people, it's like super available to you. And it's very vital. It's extremely necessary.
And you might know that in the archives, there's one person who is represented often back there, and his name is K. Leroy Irvis, who was Speaker of the House here in the state of Pennsylvania for so long, a friend of this institution, and I would say a friend of the efforts that we had going on. He made a very critical difference from a resource and policy perspective as it relates to these issues. Valerie, I don't know. It's you,
Just a few comments. I'm one of the 50. Renee, I saw Renee's in the house. I always wondered where you got my number or my name from, because I remember.
On Heron Avenue?
I remember.
We were looking for students who were culturally deprived.
You know what? I'll take it. But not only that, now you talk about that, but I know for a fact there were individuals like my former boss, Jesse Fife, who said he was in high school, he was in Oliver High School, and he heard his name over the loudspeaker. Jesse Fife come to the office, and then he was like, what did I do? And Tony Fountain, who probably was, 19, 20. Tony was about 20.
Tony wasn't in that cohort.
No, but Tony interviewed, Tony recruited. So wherever the files, I don't know where you got my name or whatever, obviously, I don't care, I'm just so happy. And then you have Joyce. Joyce is right there. Joyce
Yeah.
started in '68. Joyce wishes you had her name, right? Right. But the point is, you guys also were going around. What you did is remarkable, to the extent that, I know I was 17, you were 21. Curtis was my first African-American teacher. I had never had a black teacher in my life, and I always tease him because I really thought he was about 6'10". He just seemed like they were so smart, they were so intellectual. So what you did was incredible, because I know you contacted us the end of May, beginning of June. 2 weeks later, we had to be on campus. I was so upset because I had planned to work for the summer. And just everything that we had to do was so on point. And again, in September, then you threw us into the university system, but then we got all of the nurturing. Also, I know for a fact a lot of those 50 had no intention of coming back in September. They liked what you had to offer for the summer, probably, you know, campus, away from home, but they stayed. A lot of them had already been accepted. My roommate had already been accepted, but they were so impressed with your leadership, just like the BAS. You know, it really is so sad that we don't have more students here. I know there are a lot of African-American students here, but it's sad that they don't know about how the organization was founded, because there wouldn't be, now we have what, 9 different organizations, 9 different black organizations. There wouldn't be those 9 if you guys hadn't started the one. So I just wanted to say thank you for what you did, but just, it wasn't just the 50 of us coming, but then there were the instructors and the departments and all of that. And so the type of leadership that we had with you guys, obviously that's needed, because when you look at the number of faculty and everything, you know, the struggle still goes on. But thank you so much for what you did.
Well, thank you for that. I can tell you because I was still here working. Matter of fact, let me back up a little bit. So we did all of this as students in the summer, preparing for you guys, and we were doing it as student activists. And one day we were called to our office, or they came to the office and told us they're going to start paying us. And you know what I thought? Oh, this is the beginning of the end. I really did. I just really felt that getting paid was, I felt like I was being bought off a little, you know. But
I felt like
after,
I was getting paid. No.
Yeah, that's okay. I mean, we all have our own feelings, you know, about that. I did feel kind of
No,
bought off.
but in the light, Gail, in the light of in the light of what appears to be really, and it obviously was like a very successful entree into like a very powerful institution, and you know we made some very powerful inroads in there. But it's clear that when we look at what Carl Redwood was handing out.
And please say something about that. My husband keeps stickling to me to say something
Yeah,
about that.
I mean,
Yeah, no,
this is an accurate. This is an accurate. These are accurate
Did you
numbers.
get this? Did you get this? Did everybody get
these
this?
are
Where's
accurate
Carl?
numbers.
Is Carl here?
He
I
was
think he
here
left.
up until a moment
He
ago.
left. Yeah. Finish.
He was here up until a moment ago.
Yeah, you could talk about those numbers.
And it's clear that you know something has occurred. I know that the university went from being a private university to a state-related institution because it ran into some challenges financially, and that's way back history. And I know that we made some really significant inroads over there in the late 60s, early 70s, maybe up to the mid 80s. And I left around that time and left Pittsburgh. But you remarked how all of the institutions in the United States were impacted by
the Bakke decision in 1977. I'll say something about that, but I want to respond to your comment that you made about those 50 students. In 5 years, 28 of those students had graduated. We were never able to track all of the rest, but 28 was significantly high for students who were highly at risk and culturally deprived.
Well, wait a minute. Wait a minute.
Yeah.
5 years, 28 out of 50. That's better than 50%.
Yeah.
And that's
And
better,
more
that's
may
better
have
than
gra-
that's better than the university average. University averages 5-year graduation rates are somewhere around 43%.
Yeah, I followed it, and 6 or 7 years later, in addition, I mean, there were other students who trickled, but, you know, we monitored that. But so here I was, you know, working in retention, which is another thing that this group of people established, not just us. I mean, I think I've tried to make it clear that this was part of a national thrust. That those people who were like us in University of Pennsylvania, Penn State, everywhere else in the world, were the group of people who established retention strategies in the United States. This became this was something that addressed the need to give support to, at first, black students and students of color. But this retention strategies and these pedagogies, they've developed by our peers all over the United States because we were admitting students who heretofore had not been admitted because they didn't meet the standardized test criteria. But it was a whole kind of thought that came out of my peers all around the United States for developing retention programs to maintain these students. And to refer to Curtis's question, you know, I'm always looking at, you know, revolution, counter-revolution, right? So black admissions increased steadily after 1968 when you came. The first, you were the 50 cohort. Then Triumph admitted another 250. I mean, another 50 under Triumph. So now that's 100, right? That winter, 250 students were admitted in that program. They were called developmental scholars. Yeah, so now we have all those students who are getting admitted to special programs from the Black Action Society protests and demand, and you're getting all the other students who the university felt were not culturally deprived black students who were coming now from largely Pennsylvania, because when I was at Pitt, most of the students who were black who came to Pitt were not from the state of Pennsylvania. So this is a steady increase about 1977, and you could feel it moving. I mean, so now you're getting white backlash. And it culminated in the Bakke decision in 1977. A medical student, I believe, in Texas, who went to California. Okay, went to
UC Davis.
Thank you, Chinnis. Went to the Supreme Court because he didn't get admitted to medical school, and these kinds of declines eroded all that progress that we had made up until 1977. And there were other Supreme Court decisions as well, because these things were kind of piecemeal, you know. And this happened until right now, and we're using the Carl Redwood flyer that he passed out, that right now 1,830 black students here at Pitt, and the percentage is 5.3. I know at a time when I was studying this, like in the late, sometimes in the I'd say in the 90s, there was like 11 to 12%. So that's a tremendous decrease. And 125 full-time black faculty at 2.7% here. I think there's a lot of work to be done. One of the cries that we used to have in our demands is when they would ask us, why are you doing this? You know, we always had media up in our face all the time. And we had this one statistic, I don't even know if it was right, but we would always say it. So why are you pushing for more black students here at Pitt? I said, because the enrollment at Pitt is less than the University of Mississippi at the same time. It sounds like a good thing to say. So I believe it was also true. So,
I know when I got out of high school, there was like one black person that came to the University of Pittsburgh. And when my brother, who was 9 years my senior, and when he got out of high school in Braddock, Pennsylvania, there was one black person that came to the University of Pittsburgh. And so you're talking about in 1977, you had upwards of 12 to 15% of the student population was black. And in 2018, you got 5.3% of the population is black. I'm sure there's a larger population at the university.
Yes.
I looked up in preparation for this event, and I don't know how good the data set is or how reputable the count is, but Pitt was number 1,654th.
That's
in
disgraceful.
terms of diversity.
That's disgraceful.
Its rank as a diverse institution was 1,654th in the nation. A cluster of universities in Hawaii were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. And so they're counting diversity as they should. And I looked at my old institution. I was always bifurcated as I started at Penn State and did 2 years and came here for the subsequent 2 years of my undergraduate institution. And I ended at Penn State as a professional. So I looked at Penn State, and curiously enough, they were ranked number 534th or something. And I don't see how that could be possible because it's like the driven snow, it appears. And no harm meant. It's just that that's sort of like the way that it is at State College. And they know it, and their new chancellor knows it, and I understand that Pitt's new chancellor knows it. I'm given to understand that he's quite aware of the challenge. And so that there certainly is work to be done. I think that Chancellor Posvar was aware of the challenge.
Absolutely.
But I think that the students of the BAS were far more aware of the challenge than was he himself. Oftentimes you have a person in leadership who may be quite much aware of the challenge, but there are echelons below him or her that tardy things, that make things go a little slower. But I think that when the student sees the computer center at the University of Pittsburgh, which was an institution like Carnegie Tech, funded by the Mellons and the Scaife, some of the wealthiest people in the country, and determined that they would take the computer center as a strategic means of taking the center of communications, the core data repository of the institution, and holding it at the threat of perhaps accidentally erasing the data by somebody maybe fooling around with it, not knowing what they were doing, that the chancellor was even more liberal about the willingness to accede to the demands of these students, which were quite in line with what ought to have been happening anyway. Ramona Montier, who came to Pitt when I got out of high school, was way smarter than me, and I was way smarter than most people. And so there ought to have been more students who came to this university. There ought to be more students who are here now. And I think that that challenge needs to be met. But I think that in addition to Bakke, I just took a quick glimpse just to remind myself that if Bakke was in 77, Ronald Reagan was in 1980. I don't know whose politics are in this room. But if you look at, we've been talking about Stokely Carmichael and cursorily Malcolm X and certainly Martin Luther King and the civil rights and Vietnam, anti-Vietnam War and those, the tripartite universities that you mentioned, the legacy universities of radicalism. But if you look at the backlash, if you look at from the United States from 1980, in terms of how the United States has whipsawed back and forth between a liberal phase to a conservative phase, and if you look at to where we are now, it probably shouldn't surprise us that these institutions have really pulled back on things like diversity. As a matter of fact, when we talk about diversity in and of itself has become kind of like one of those iffy words, you know? Reputable people are putting air quotes around diversity now, as though it's kind of like it's like a meaningless word. Yeah, you know, diversity. There are lots of challenges, and I think they accede to, again, that political front. I think there's a shift that needs to occur, and I trust that it is occurring, because not only, I would just say that, It's clearly that the nation has shifted along with the Baki. Baki was funded by somebody. Somebody's interests were at foot. He didn't have all the money to pay for that Supreme Court case. And they've been funding the political change that we see now. So,
Any more questions?
Any more?
Thank you, Curtis.
Any more questions?
I'm sorry.
Oh, you got some comments?
There's
You gotta
actually,
go?
on the topic of Black History Month,
Okay.
there's actually Dollar Bank is having something.
Okay, they gotta go.
Yeah, we'll
Yeah.
both head in
Okay, the forces of politics and business are on the way.
We want her
With
to-
one question.
She was in the 50 cohort.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Renee.
I was.
Dr. Smith.
Clark.
Clark.
Dr. Smith
Clark.
Smith Clark.
Nevertheless, I was one of the kids in the computer center. And the reason, and I look back, we could have got killed, slaughtered. Because, you know, they don't play with technology, and they don't play about that money. They'd have blown our brains out about that technology of us taking over their computer center. But one of the reasons that we weren't in fear of doing that is because of the BAS. Because our mentors worked with us all summer, with B.B. Campbell Moore, and
Yeah.
all of them took us under their wing and taught us how to behave, taught us what to say and what not to say. They grew us as a group. When you look at the concept of groupthink, they taught us how to manage ourselves. I did stay with the university. I'm one of the 28. I have my doctoral degree from here. And my entire expense for my education came out of the pocket of the University of Pittsburgh. I don't think I've paid more than, I'd say, $1,000.
Yes, you did. You paid taxes.
Oh, I paid, well, I mean in terms of my parents having to write a check. The university picked up those costs. And it wasn't because I was a bad student. Believe me, they had some standards. You didn't just stay here on a 1.3 GPA. So I want to give credit and thank you to my mentors from 1967 to 1968, because you all grew a hell of a group of people. That Judy Price is still out there, and Sheila Garnett. We're all out here. And we talk to each other on Facebook all the time. Okay, so we're out here, and we're helping to grow the next generation of warriors, too. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we've had a lively discussion, a lot of very key points that should be something that you keep in mind. The efforts that started with Bakke and goes through Hopwood in Michigan and Prop 209 in California and on, really do make a difference. One of the things that I do know is that if you're going to recruit and you're going to retain students, you're going to do it intentionally. It is not going to be something that is organic. You're going to have a very strategic and intentional effort to do so. One of the things that Curtis mentioned about us not having cell phones, I can remember that if there was any issue on this campus that needed to be addressed somehow over in the lower lounge of the student union, you would gather 40 people. We wouldn't know how they got there. Somehow the message got around without cell phones. But I think this tornado of effort was always there, and all of us were swept up in trying to make this institution the best institution that it could be, provide its resources to the communities of need, regionally, statewide, and so forth. So as you go from this experience, Gail talked about a call to action. It is always a call to action, and if there's to be something that is sustained, as has been the BAS over these 50 years, it will be as a result of the collective, as a result of those people who are allied with each other and make these things happen. So thank our panel. for all of their conversation. This is a wealth of historic wisdom, and if you have a chance to talk to them one-on-one, I would suggest you do so. Eat cake, drink whatever that is back there. I know it's not spiked or anything, and thanks for coming. We appreciate it.